I never expected that hiring a personal trainer would completely change my life, but that's exactly what happened. It sounds like the setup for a cheesy romantic comedy, I know. But my life at 26 had become a flat line of routine, a comfortable but deeply isolating loop of waking up, working from my small apartment, and then watching the city lights blink on from my window, feeling like a ghost in my own story. The decision to join a gym was less about health and more about desperation, a last-ditch effort to feel like I was physically present in the world. Let me take you back. My name is Miles, and I work as a freelance graphic designer. It's a job I love, but it's one that keeps me tethered to a screen, lost in pixels and color codes for 10 hours a day. My social life had dwindled to a few text chains and the occasional forced holiday gathering. I wasn't unhappy, not exactly. I was just muted. There was a quiet loneliness that had settled over me like a fine layer of dust, and I had forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen. The gym was an assault on the senses. It smelled of clean rubber, sweat, and a faint, sharp tang of disinfectant. It was loud, a constant clang of metal, and the low thumping bass of music I didn't recognize. And it was full of people who seemed to move with a purpose I couldn't comprehend. They lifted, they ran, they grunted. They were bodies in motion, confident and capable. I felt like an anthropologist studying a foreign tribe, notebook and pen conspicuously absent. And then I saw him. Julian. He was one of the trainers, his name stitched in blue on his black polo shirt. He moved through the gym like he owned it, not with arrogance, but with a kind of fluid, easy grace. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his shirt and arms that showed the clear definition of years of dedicated work. His hair was dark and a little messy, and when he smiled at a client, his whole face lit up. From my safe space on a forgotten treadmill in the corner, I watched him. It became a new part of my routine. He had a way of making people feel at ease, touching an arm to correct a bicep curl, offering a low word of encouragement that would make someone's grimace of effort soften into a determined frown. He was all confidence and warmth, a sun in the center of this strange, metallic solar system. To me, he felt like a different species entirely. He was the kind of guy I assumed dated cheerleaders in high school and models now. He was effortlessly, incandescently straight. That was the story I told myself, anyway. It was safer that way. For weeks, this was my gym experience. An hour of fumbling with machines I didn't understand, feeling my anxiety rise with every sidelong glance from someone who actually knew what they were doing, all while I tracked Julian's movements from the corner of my eye. I was making zero progress. My arms still felt like noodles, and my primary exercise was the nervous walk from the water fountain to the locker room. The loneliness I'd hoped to escape was just following me here, now with the added scent of industrial cleaner. I knew something had to change. The dust was getting thicker. One Tuesday afternoon, after a particularly pathetic attempt at using a machine that looked like a medieval torture device, I saw him at the front desk, laughing with the receptionist. His laugh was deep and genuine. It was the final push I needed. My heart started hammering against my ribs, a frantic, desperate beat. I told myself it was now or never. I was either going to quit the gym or I was going to actually try. I walked over, my palms sweating, my mouth suddenly dry. I felt small and insignificant as I approached. He turned as I neared the desk, his smile softening into a polite, questioning look. "Can I help you?" he asked. His voice was even better up close. Calmer, lower. I swallowed, the sound loud in my own ears. Yeah? Hi. I was, interested in signing up for some personal training sessions." The words came out in a rush, clumsy and thin. I avoided looking directly at him, focusing instead on a crack in the laminate countertop. He leaned forward, grabbing a tablet and a stylus. "Great. We can definitely get you set up. Have you worked with a trainer before?" I shook my head, feeling a flush creep up my neck. "No, never. I'm pretty new to all of this," I admitted, gesturing vaguely at the entire gym. He gave me a reassuring smile, and for the first time, I felt the full force of it directed at me. It was disarming. "Hey, that's what we're here for. Everyone starts somewhere. My name's Julian," he offered a hand. His grip was firm and warm, his hand dwarfing mine. The brief contact sent a ridiculous jolt through my system. "Miles," I managed to say. "Miles," he repeated, and the way he said my name made it sound solid. Real. He looked at his schedule on the tablet. So, what are your goals? What made you decide to sign up today? I couldn't very well say. I'm cripplingly lonely, and I've been watching you for a month. So I mumbled something generic about wanting to get stronger and feel healthier. It wasn't a lie, just a significant understatement of the truth. He nodded, his expression serious and focused. He was all business now, but the warmth was still there, simmering just beneath the surface. Okay, we can do that. Now, my training style is pretty direct, he said, looking up from the tablet to meet my eyes. I found that for most people, especially when they're starting out, things don't really click unless it's hands-on. We'll be focused on form, on making sure you're feeling the right muscles engage. Is that something you're comfortable with? My brain short-circuited. Hands-on. The phrase hung in the air between us, charged with a meaning he couldn't possibly intend. I pictured his hands on my back, my arms, guiding me. It was both terrifying and electrifying. All I could do was nod dumbly, my voice having completely abandoned me. Perfect, he said, seemingly oblivious to my internal meltdown. He scheduled our first session for 2 days later. As I walked away from the desk, my legs felt unsteady. I had done it. I had closed the distance. But in doing so, I had just signed up for a very specific, very personal kind of torment. The man I had placed on an untouchable pedestal was now going to be touching me, and he had warned me it was going to be hands-on. I had no idea just how true that would turn out to be. The first session was a blur of nerves and awkwardness, at least on my part. Julian, however, was the consummate professional. He was patient, breaking down movements into simple, manageable steps. He had me do a series of basic exercises, squats, push-ups against a bar, planks, just to assess my starting point. My starting point, it turned out, was somewhere below zero. I was weaker than I thought, and my body seemed to have no idea how to coordinate itself. It's all right, he said, his voice calm and steady as I wobbled during a lunge. It's all muscle memory. We just have to create the memories. He spoke about fitness not as a quest for a perfect body, but as a conversation between your mind and your muscles. It was surprisingly thoughtful, almost philosophical. This wasn't the jock I had built up in my head. This was someone who thought deeply about his work. His hands were a constant, guiding presence, but it was all very clinical. A light touch on my lower back during a squat. Keep your core tight, he'd murmur. A tap on my shoulder blade. Pull them back and down. Each touch was brief, precise, and entirely professional. Yet, for me, each one landed like a tiny spark, a brief flare of heat that I had to consciously ignore. I spent the entire hour trying to keep my breathing even and my face neutral, terrified that my attraction would somehow become glaringly obvious. By our third session, a fragile rhythm had started to form between us. My initial terror had subsided into a low-grade, manageable anxiety. I was starting to learn the language of the gym, the names of the exercises, the feeling of a muscle working correctly. Julian's presence became less intimidating and more grounding. He had a knack for knowing exactly when to push me and when to offer a word of encouragement. It was during that session that something shifted. I was on the cable machine, attempting a row. I was pulling, but my form was all wrong. I was using my arms, my back hunched over. No, Julian said gently, stepping closer. You're pulling with your ego, not your lats. I stopped, confused. He chuckled, a low, warm sound. Let me show you. He stood behind me, much closer than he ever had before. Relax your arms, he instructed. He placed one hand flat against my back, between my shoulder blades. The warmth of his palms seeped through my thin t-shirt, a sudden, shocking heat that made my breath catch. His other hand went to my stomach. Now brace your core. Imagine someone's about to punch you. I did as he said, my entire body tensing under his touch. His chest was pressed lightly against my back, and I could feel the solid wall of him behind me. The rest of the gym, the clanging weights and distant chatter, seemed to fade into a dull roar. All I could feel was the pressure of his hands, the heat of his body. Okay, he said, his voice a low rumble so close to my ear. Now, I want you to think about pulling your elbows back, but initiate the movement from here. He pressed his fingers slightly deeper into the muscles of my back. Squeeze your shoulder blades together, like you're trying to hold a pencil between them. His hand was still on my stomach, a steady, grounding weight. I pulled, and for the first time, I felt it. A deep, satisfying contraction in my upper back. There, he said, his voice full of approval. You feel that? That's it. I nodded, unable to speak. His hands lingered for a second longer than they needed to. A beat. 2 beats. It was a tiny eternity where the professional context seemed to dissolve, leaving only the simple, undeniable reality of his body against mine. Then, just as quickly, he stepped back, and the space between us felt vast and cold. Good, he said, his voice sounding a little strained. 10 more like that. He was all business again, but the air had changed. A line had been crossed, not in a physical sense, but in an unspoken one. He had shown me more than just how to do an exercise. He had let me feel his focus, his closeness, and in that moment, I had felt a flicker of something that was definitely not in the personal training manual. It was a small, significant moment, a secret shared through touch, and it planted a seed of dangerous, impossible hope in my chest. He had also, in that moment, revealed a sliver of his own story. As I was catching my breath after the set, I asked him what he meant by pulling with your ego. He hesitated for a second, then gave me a wry smile. When I started lifting, I just wanted to be big, he explained, his voice softer now. I'd pile on weight I couldn't handle, use terrible form, and just heave it around. It was all for show. I hurt my shoulder pretty bad doing that. He told me about his recovery, about having to start from scratch with tiny weights, focusing on the mind-muscle connection he was now teaching me. It wasn't about looking strong. It was about being strong from the inside out. It humbled me, he said quietly. Taught me that real strength isn't about the weight on the bar. It's about control, discipline. This was the hidden side I never would have guessed at. The confident, easygoing trainer had his own history of insecurity, of learning things the hard way. It made him seem suddenly, breathtakingly human. He wasn't a sun god on a pedestal anymore. He was just Julian, a guy who had figured some things out and was trying to help me do the same. And that, I realized with a sinking feeling, was far more dangerous for my heart. That little seed of hope began to sprout, watered by our weekly sessions. Julian's hands-on approach became the new normal, but it never felt clinical again. There was a charge to it now, a low hum of awareness that I felt every time he stepped into my space to adjust my form. I became a scholar of his touch, the firm pressure on my hips during a deadlift, the light guidance of his fingers on my forearms during a curl, the way his hand would sometimes brush against mine when he passed me a dumbbell. I analyzed every interaction, every lingering glance, every shared laugh, searching for confirmation of what I'd felt. I started to look forward to our sessions with an intensity that was almost painful. They were the 1 hour of my week that felt vibrant and real, a stark contrast to the gray routine of my life. We fell into an easy rhythm of conversation, talking about movies, music, the frustrations of freelance work versus the demands of a physical job. I found out he was an amazing cook and had a secret love for old black and white films. Each new detail I learned about him made him more real, more attractive, and the chasm between my hopes and my fears grew wider. Was this all in my head? Was I just a lonely guy projecting his fantasies onto the first kind, handsome man who showed him some attention? The thought was a constant, nagging companion. He was my trainer. This was his job. His warmth and encouragement were tools of his trade, expertly wielded to build client rapport and ensure repeat business. To think it was anything more was foolish, wasn't it? But then he'd smile at me in that specific way, a little crinkle at the corners of his eyes, and the hope would surge back, fierce and undeniable. This internal tug-of-war was exhausting. My anxiety, which had been quieted, returned with a vengeance, now focused entirely on him. I'd overthink everything. Did he stand too close today? Or was he being deliberately distant? Did that compliment about my progress mean something more, or was it just a script he used with everyone? I was living in a state of heightened emotional suspense, and I knew it was unsustainable. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The gym was quiet, the weather having kept most people away. It was just me, Julian, and a few other dedicated souls scattered around the cavernous space. The air was thick with the smell of rain and damp pavement, a scent that always made me feel a little melancholy. We were at the end of our session, and Julian suggested we finish with some deep stretching to help with my flexibility, which was, to put it mildly, non-existent. We're going to do a deep hamstring stretch, he announced. It's intense, but it's one of the best things for you, especially since you sit so much for work, He had me lie on my back on a mat. Okay, bring your right leg straight up. I did, my leg trembling from the effort and the tightness in the muscle. Good. Now, I'm going to help you deepen it. You just tell me when it's too much. The key is to breathe through the discomfort, not fight it. He knelt beside me, his presence solid and warm in the cool air of the gym. He took my extended leg, his hands wrapping firmly around my calf and ankle. All right, Miles, just relax. Let me take the weight. His voice was a low, soothing murmur, and I instinctively did as he asked. The simple act of surrendering that control, of letting him hold me, felt intensely intimate. Slowly, carefully, he began to press my leg back towards my chest, pushing the stretch deeper. The pull in my hamstring was sharp, electric. I hissed in a breath. Breathe, he commanded softly. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Just breathe into the stretch. His face was close to mine, his focus entirely on me. I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw. I closed my eyes, trying to focus on my breathing as the intensity mounted. The gym, the world, everything faded away until there was only the sharp, burning sensation in my leg, the steady pressure of his hands, and the sound of his voice guiding me. He adjusted his grip, one hand moving to my thigh, the other remaining on my ankle, his touch steadying and sure. His initial promise echoed in my mind. Hands on, or it won't click. This was more than hands on. This was a complete surrender. To help me get a better angle, he shifted his position. He moved to straddle my other leg, his body now directly over mine. He wasn't touching me anywhere else, but the sheer proximity was overwhelming. He leaned in, using his body weight to gently increase the pressure. His head was right above mine, his chest hovering inches from my face. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, smell the faint, clean scent of his soap mixed with the smell of rain on his clothes. And in that moment, something broke. The careful barrier of professionalism, the roles of trainer and client, they didn't just blur, they evaporated completely. This was no longer an exercise. It was something else, something terrifyingly vulnerable and profoundly intimate. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could feel the vibration through the floor. I opened my eyes and looked up at him. His gaze was fixed on my face, his expression unreadable. The intensity was still there, but it was mixed with something else now. A question, a hesitation. Time seemed to slow down, to stretch and warp like the muscle in my leg. We were frozen there for what felt like an hour, my leg held in the air by his strong hands, his body a warm, solid presence over mine, the unspoken tension a tangible thing in the air between us. The noise of a weight dropping somewhere in the gym shattered the spell. Julian blinked, as if waking from a dream. A dark flush crept up his neck, and he immediately eased the pressure on my leg and moved back, clearing his throat. He looked away, busying himself with adjusting the mat, not meeting my eyes. Okay, he said, his voice rough. Let's do the other side. But the damage was done. The air was thick with what had just passed between us, a silent acknowledgement that a line had been irrevocably crossed. He had promised a hands-on approach, but neither of us had been prepared for this. His hands had done more than just guide my body. They had laid bare a truth that now lay exposed and trembling on a gym mat on a rainy Thursday afternoon. And we both knew it. The aftermath of that moment was excruciating. The final few minutes of our session were conducted in a thick, suffocating silence. Julian moved with a stiff, formal politeness, keeping his distance, his hands now firmly to himself. He called out instructions from several feet away, his voice clipped and impersonal. The warmth and ease that had grown between us were gone, replaced by a chasm of awkwardness. I couldn't look at him. My own embarrassment was a hot flush that wouldn't fade. I felt exposed, as if he had read the hope and longing in my mind during those stretched-out seconds on the mat. When the hour was finally over, I mumbled a quick, thanks, and practically fled to the locker room, my heart still racing. The walk home in the persistent drizzle did nothing to cool the fever in my brain. I replayed the moment over and over again. The way he'd looked at me, the sudden tension in his body, the flush that had colored his neck. Was it just my imagination? Did he look at me with something more than professional concern, or was I just a desperate romantic, projecting my own feelings onto a situation that had none? My mind became a courtroom. The prosecutor, a vicious, cynical version of myself, argued that it was nothing. Julian was just doing his job, perhaps a bit too intensely. He was probably embarrassed that he had made a client uncomfortable, that he had been unprofessional. The awkwardness was his attempt to reset the boundary I had so clearly misinterpreted. His flush wasn't attraction, it was shame. But then my defense attorney, a smaller, more hopeful voice, would present its evidence. The lingering touches over the past few weeks. The way he shared personal stories. The look in his eyes in that moment. It wasn't embarrassment. It was recognition. It was the same whirlwind of confusion and intensity that I was feeling. The silence afterwards wasn't a rejection. It was mutual shock. We had both been surprised by the charge that had suddenly erupted between us. I spent the next 2 days in a state of suspended animation, caught between these two warring narratives. I'd feel a surge of hope, a flutter in my chest at the memory of his closeness, only to have it crushed by a wave of doubt and self-recrimination. He probably thought I was pathetic. He was probably dreading our next session. Should I cancel it? Should I just ghost him and find a new gym on the other side of town? The thought of facing him again filled me with a paralyzing dread. The idea of quitting was tempting. It was the safe option, the path of least resistance. It would save me from potential rejection and humiliation. I could just retreat back into my quiet, dusty life where the only heartbreaks were fictional and the only tension was in a story I was reading. But then I'd remember the feeling of his hand on my back, the sound of his voice in my ear, the brief, exhilarating feeling of being truly seen. Giving that up without knowing for sure felt like a different kind of failure. It felt like cowardice. My anxiety was a physical thing, a tight knot in my stomach that made it hard to eat or focus on work. I was living entirely inside my own head, dissecting every word, every gesture, every stolen glance from the past month. I was analyzing the data, trying to find a definitive answer, but there wasn't one. The only way to know the truth was to face the source of the uncertainty itself. Our next session was scheduled for Saturday morning. It was our final one in the initial block I'd paid for. As the day approached, my resolve wavered a dozen times. I even picked up my phone to type out a cancellation text, my thumb hovering over the send button. But I couldn't do it. I had to know. I had to see him one more time, even if it was just to have my hopes definitively crushed. At least then I could move on. At least then the horrible suspense would be over. Saturday morning arrived, bright and sunny, a cruel contrast to the storm raging inside me. I walked to the gym, feeling like a man on his way to the gallows. I was bracing myself for the cold professionalism, the polite distance, the final confirmation that it had all been in my head. I was preparing for the end, one way or another. The final session was just as tense as I had feared. In fact, it was worse. Julian was polite, yes, but it was the icy politeness of a stranger. He stood at a distance, demonstrating exercises on a machine next to mine rather than guiding me on my own. The easy banter was gone, replaced by short, direct commands. 10 reps, keep your back straight, breathe. His hands-on policy had been officially and completely revoked. His hands never left his pockets unless it was to point at a piece of equipment. Every minute of that hour was a fresh twist of the knife. This, I thought, was my answer. His distance was a clear message. The other day was a mistake, a line crossed, and it would not happen again. The prosecutor in my head was having a field day. See, he's shutting you down. He's uncomfortable. You made it weird. The hopeful voice was silent, utterly defeated. I just had to get through the hour, pay for the session, and walk out of his life forever. I moved through the exercises mechanically, my body on autopilot while my mind was already mourning the loss of something I never even had. The disappointment was a heavy, physical weight in my chest. I felt foolish and naive. How could I have let myself believe it was anything more? When the hour was finally, mercifully over, I couldn't get out of there fast enough. Well, that's time, he said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. Yeah, thanks, I mumbled, not meeting his eye. I turned to grab my water bottle and towel from the bench, my movements jerky and rushed. This was it. The escape. I just had to make it to the door. I took a step towards the locker room, my escape route clear. Miles, wait. His voice stopped me cold. I froze, my back still to him. My heart, which had been sinking steadily for the past hour, suddenly shot into my throat. Slowly, I turned to face him. He was standing there by the weight rack, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression a mixture of frustration and something else I couldn't quite decipher. The cool, professional mask was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability that shocked me. Can we talk for a second? He asked, his voice low and strained. He gestured towards a quiet corner by the empty yoga studio. My mind went blank. All I could do was nod. We walked over in silence, the space between us charged with 1,000 unspoken words. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I was starting to realize he only did when he was nervous. He wouldn't look at me, instead staring at the floor as if gathering his thoughts. Look, he started, finally lifting his eyes to meet mine. They were filled with an apology. I know I've been off today, and on Thursday. I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable. My immediate instinct was to let him off the hook, to say it was fine, that I didn't notice, to smooth everything over and allow us both a dignified retreat. But I was tired of retreating. I just looked at him, waiting. He took a deep breath. The thing is, he said, his voice dropping even lower, forcing me to lean in slightly to hear him. It wasn't you. It was me. I was the one who was uncomfortable. Because I was being unprofessional, he paused, searching for the right words. That moment, during the stretch, I crossed a line, and I've been trying to figure out how to walk it back ever since, how to fix it. My heart sank. So I was right. He was regretting it. You don't have to, I began, but he held up a hand to stop me. No, let me finish, he said, his gaze intense. This is going to sound crazy, and if I'm totally misreading this, just tell me to shut up and I will never bring it up again. I swear. This is probably going to get me fired. He let out a short, humorless laugh. But I have to say it. He took another step closer, closing the distance he had so carefully maintained all day. Miles, the reason I crossed a line is because I wanted to. The reason I've been so distant is because I was terrified of doing it again. I haven't been able to think about anything else for the past 2 days. The world tilted on its axis. The air rushed out of my lungs. I just stared at him, dumbfounded, as his confession hung in the air between us. I know my whole thing is being hands-on, he continued, a faint, self-deprecating smile on his lips. But with you it's different. It has been from the start. I kept telling myself to keep it professional, to just be your trainer. But it's not that easy. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for some kind of sign. I'm not just trying to be your trainer. I was hoping. I don't know. I was hoping for more. The hopeful voice in my head, the one that had been beaten into silence, suddenly roared back to life. It took me a second to find my own voice, and when I did, it was barely a whisper. You were. A wave of relief washed over his face at my simple question. Yeah, he breathed out. God, yeah. For weeks. And just like that, the tension that had been coiling inside me for days, for weeks, finally snapped. I felt a laugh bubble up from my chest, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. Me too, I said, and this time my voice was stronger. I thought I was completely losing my mind. I thought it was all in my head. Julian's answering smile was like the sun breaking through the clouds. It was brilliant and real and aimed directly at me. So I didn't get this totally wrong. No, I said, shaking my head, a grin spreading across my face. You definitely didn't get it wrong. He closed the remaining space between us, and this time there was no hesitation. He gently cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. His touch was electric. Can I? He asked softly, his gaze dropping to my lips. I couldn't speak. I just nodded. And then he kissed me. It wasn't like the movies. It was slow and hesitant at first, a question. And then, as I leaned into him, as I kissed him back, it became something else entirely. It was confident and sure, a confirmation of everything that had been simmering beneath the surface. It was the end of the suspense and the beginning of everything else. In the quiet corner of a loud gym, I was finally, truly, being seen. The weeks that followed the confession felt like waking up from a long, colorless dream. The world suddenly seemed brighter, sharper. My lonely apartment didn't feel so empty anymore. Julian and I started spending time together outside the fluorescent lights and clanging weights of the gym. He found another trainer to take over my sessions, officially and happily ending our professional relationship so we could start a personal one. Our first date was simple. We went for a walk in the park, and then he cooked dinner for me at his place. I learned that his passion for cooking was just as intense as his passion for fitness. He moved around his kitchen with the same focused grace he had in the gym, explaining the why behind each step, just as he had with every exercise. It was wonderfully, comfortingly familiar. We talked for hours that night, really talked. We filled in the gaps, the weeks of observation and unspoken feelings. He admitted he'd noticed me long before I ever approached him at the front desk, that he had been drawn to my quiet, observant nature, which stood out so much in the loud, performative environment of the gym. He confessed that when I signed up for sessions with him, he'd had a moment of panic, worried he wouldn't be able to keep his feelings in check. I, in turn, told him about my life, my work, the quiet loneliness that had prompted me to join the gym in the first place. I told him how I'd put him on a pedestal, how I'd been convinced he was completely out of my league. He'd just shaken his head, a soft smile on his face, and told me he felt the exact same way about me. It was a dizzying, beautiful realization. We were both just people, full of the same hopes and fears, just trying to find our way. Our connection deepened with every shared meal, every late-night conversation, every quiet moment spent simply existing in the same space. I discovered that beneath his confident exterior was a deeply kind and gentle soul. He learned that beneath my anxious, quiet surface was a strength I was only just beginning to recognize in myself. He brought a vibrant energy into my life, and I, in turn, offered him a calm space where he didn't have to perform or be on for anyone. We fit together in a way that felt both surprising and inevitable. A few months later, I was sitting on the couch in his apartment, watching him move around the kitchen. The evening light was filtering through the window, casting long shadows across the room. He was humming along to some old song on the radio, completely at ease. He caught me watching him and smiled that smile, the one that still made my heart skip a beat. "What?" he asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Nothing," I said, smiling back. "I was just thinking about that first day, when you told me your training style was hands-on." He laughed, a rich, warm sound that filled the room. He walked over and sat next to me, draping an arm around my shoulders and pulling me close. "I seem to recall it worked," he teased, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. "It clicked, didn't it?" I leaned into his side, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. The quiet dust of my old life felt like a distant memory, a story about someone else. I had walked into that gym looking for a way to feel present in my own life, and I had found it, but not in the way I expected. I found it not in the lifting of weights, but in the brave, terrifying, wonderful act of letting someone in. It turned out that the most important connection wasn't between mind and muscle, but between two hearts, finally willing to be vulnerable. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this was just the beginning.